you very much, Trevor, and thank you for bringing me back that pet penguin. We're really getting on well. We'll have lunch after this, but our final presentation of the morning is Grace Adams, Renewable Energy and Local Opposition, a story of floating solar in San Diego. Grace, the floor is yours.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So in August of last year, I met a woman named Karen. I mentioned that I was a journalist studying climate science and policy, and she told me that she thought climate change was an overused term and that there were other issues that were more important. I personally think that climate change is one of the most important issues and was a little caught off guard by this, but I was curious, so I asked and wanted to learn more, so I asked what she meant. That's when she told me about the Sweetwater Reservoir floating solar project, a proposal to put floating solar panels on a reservoir near her home. To me, this seemed like an interesting and innovative idea, the type of project we need to address climate change. But Karen wasn't on board at all. In fact, she was very opposed to the project, and she felt it was being rushed in the name of addressing climate change, despite concerns from the community. So for my capstone, I decided to take a closer look at the Sweetwater floating solar proposal. And after months of reporting, interviewing experts, doing research, talking to community members, and watching and attending public meetings, I've been compiling the findings into a narrative podcast that tells the story of the project, examines the community's concerns, places it in the broader context of climate change, and explores how local agencies, developers, and governments can better engage with communities to more successfully implement the renewable energy projects needed to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. So today, I want to tell you that story. So this is the Sweetwater Reservoir. It's a 960-acre body of water located in South San Diego County. And while it is a human-made reservoir, you wouldn't necessarily know it from looking at it. There are bushes, shrubs, and flowers blooming around the water's edge. Birds chirp, lizards dart between rocks. The sound of the freeway can be heard in the distance, and the occasional plane flies overhead. But it's a bit of an oasis in this largely urban and suburban area. It's also a source of drinking water for nearly 200,000 people. And for the local water authority, it seemed like the perfect place to pilot an innovative climate project. Floating solar, panels that would sit, floating, atop the surface of the water, glistening in the sun and generating energy for the Sweetwater Authority, the local water agency that owns and oversees the reservoir. So the concept of floating solar panels is relatively new in the field of renewable energy. The first project was done in Japan in 2007, and since then it has taken off and grown significantly around the world. A recent study from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory found that if floating solar was put on all federally owned reservoirs in the US that could host it, it would be enough to power nearly 100 million homes a year. And that's just federally owned bodies of water, not taking into account local and state-owned reservoirs like Sweetwater, which Carlos Quintero, the general manager of the Sweetwater Authority, said made it seem like a win-win-win for the community, the water authority, and the climate.
At the time, with the floating solar, it really did present it seemed like a really great opportunity for us to not only offset our carbon generation, but also save money for our ratepayers. So that was the goal. But the community was not very supportive. At the time, with the floating solar.
And the community made their voices heard. As word of the potential project spread, flyers began circulating. Save Sweetwater Reservoir, they read. Protect our drinking water, and linked to a petition. A petition which received 675 signatures. Among the concerns were how the panels would affect the quality of water from the reservoir.
I just don't see how you're going to be able to
We have to take that into
maintain
consideration.
the quality of water,
not just the
in
drinking water and how it affects us
reservoir,
humans,
so
but
that we can
also
drink,
how it affects
so
all
that our
the
children
other
and our grandchildren don't
animals
have
and creatures
issues
that we
with this
share our
in the future.
environments with.
Okay. How it would impact the environment.
We have to take that into consideration. Not just the drinking water and how it affects us humans, but also how it affects all the other animals and creatures that we share our environments with.
And simply how it would look.
When you're walking around in the hills around the reservoir, you don't want to look at a bunch of solar panels on the water. It's like industrializing a naturally beautiful area.
And this type of pushback isn't unique to the Sweetwater project. In many ways, the story of the Sweetwater Reservoir is playing out across the country as we race to build the renewable energy projects needed to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. We know that we need to move quickly to stop burning fossil fuels, and transitioning to renewable energy is a huge part of this. The technology exists, it's becoming increasingly affordable, we just have to scale it up. And a recent study from the Pew Research Center found that a majority of Americans support doing just that. But from wind farms to geothermal plants and solar arrays, nobody seems to be able to agree on where to build it and how to get communities on board. A study published in the journal Energy Policy examined sources of opposition to renewable energy projects in the US. Of 53 different projects studied, 34% experienced delays or difficulties getting permits, 49% were canceled altogether, and 26% were carried out, but only after being paused for several months or years. The researchers estimate that all of this has resulted in a loss of nearly 4,600 megawatts of potential generating capacity. That's enough to power about 4 million homes. Lawrence Susskind is one of the authors of the paper and a professor at MIT, who said it can be easy to label these concerns as NIMBYism, or not in my backyard, the idea that residents are going to object to any development near them. I interviewed him for the podcast, and he said this label can be used to brush aside community concerns, and that it too often is what coverage of these issues focuses on, but that there is value in going deeper and trying to understand and actually address the concerns. Specifically, he said,
most journalists are unbelievably lazy when it comes to this question of local opposition. It's very easy to put a NIMBY label on any kind of conflict at the local level. Most journalists are unbelievably lazy when it...
We get it. All right. So, in the interest of not being a lazy journalist, I decided to take a deeper look into the concerns surrounding the Sweetwater Floating Solar Project. I did a deep dive into floating solar research, watched and attended public meetings, conducted over 20 interviews with community members, scientists, and government officials, and scripted a 30-minute podcast episode about it all. Throughout this process, I identified several main community concerns in addition to the appearance and aesthetics of the project. First is that, like I said earlier, floating solar is still a relatively new technology, and several of the researchers I spoke with said they wouldn't feel totally confident deploying it on a drinking water reservoir without more research, specifically on the potential of the panels to leach contaminants into the water, which ties into the next main concern, which was water quality impacts. This concern was heightened in the Sweetwater community by the recent discovery of the existence of PFAS, or forever chemicals, in the reservoir. And finally, and this was really one of the biggest concerns, was lack of community engagement. From the beginning, community members felt that they weren't being given enough information about the project or having their concerns taken into consideration. So what happened with the Sweetwater Floating Solar Project? Now, several years after it was first introduced, the project is essentially dead in the water. While there are multiple reasons as to why, and you'll have to listen to the podcast for the whole story, the community never did get on board with the idea. Just last month, I attended a meeting of the Sweetwater Authority where they decided to stop pursuing floating solar specifically and instead hire a consultant to evaluate renewable energy options for the agency more broadly. For Karen and other community members, this was a victory.
And I believe it's a good step. And that consultant will look at all renewable energy options available for the agency to come up with the very best recommendations.
And she said, if floating solar is found to be a good option for Sweetwater and the authority engages more effectively with the community, she could get on board with the idea.
Yeah, if floating solar is demonstrated to be the path forward, they're going to have the math and the support to show that. That's all the community wanted.
So, while the reasons for opposition and their merits can be discussed and debated all day long, the fact remains, these projects are very likely going to need to go in somebody's backyard, and engaging the community and taking their concerns into account is an essential step in that process. Here's Larry Susskind again.
You have to go slow to go fast. You have to engage people at a point at which they can still have an effect. And when you engage them, it's not a question of collecting their various views. It's a process of asking them to participate in producing an informed consensus about whether and how to proceed. When people say it's going to take too long, we say you can only go at the speed of trust. You have to.
But it is also a matter of helping people understand the urgency of climate change and seeing the ways in which it intersects with issues and the things they care about. Because while there is clearly value in a more informed and transparent process for making decisions about renewable energy projects, taking the actions needed to address the climate crisis will require compromise. And if we can help people to see and understand that through communication and engagement, maybe the speed of trust can be a little bit faster. I'm hopeful that journalism, especially investigative journalism at the local level, can play a role in this by helping explore and understand people's concerns, but also contextualize them within the broader issue of climate change and the need to take urgent action to address it. So throughout this process, I've had the pleasure of working with an amazing committee. Katie Watkins is the former environment reporter for Houston Public Media, and Mackenzie Elmer is the environment reporter for Voice of San Diego, and they're both incredible journalists who have provided so much guidance and support throughout this process. And Corey has been kind enough to serve as my chair. And so now, if I have time, I want to play just a rough trailer for the podcast. In February of 2023, Karen Henry issued a warning to the governing board of her local water authority.
From what I know of this community and the trail users, the authority should plan for opposition.
The agency was discussing a proposal to help meet their energy needs with solar panels. But not just any solar panels, floating solar panels that would sit on the surface of the Sweetwater Reservoir, a reservoir which helps supply drinking water for nearly 200,000 people in southeast San Diego County.
The consultant said the environmental part would be easy, but that would be untrue should public controversy come knocking.
As Karen predicted, controversy did indeed come knocking.
I come to you with my continued concerns over the floating solar system proposed for our drinking water supply.
Concerns ranged from aesthetics to environmental impact.
When you're walking around in the hills around the reservoir, you don't want to look at a bunch of solar panels on the water. It's like industrializing a naturally beautiful area.
While proponents of the project argued that it would actually benefit the ecology of the reservoir.
It would reduce evaporation and improved and stabilized ecological habitats for aquatic species.
Not to mention decrease CO2 and help the agency meet its climate goals.
I'm just calling in tonight to express our support for the floating solar project. We need to urgently implement climate solutions that will reduce emissions and improve quality of life for all of us.
In many ways, the story of the Sweetwater Reservoir floating solar project is a story that is playing out across the country as the need to transition to renewable energy becomes increasingly clear in the face of climate change. It is a story of complex local politics and lack of trust in government agencies.
It is troubling that the thoughts of the quid pro quo and kickback have crossed my mind.
A story of conflicting viewpoints and values.
I think that the opposition people don't really understand the impacts of climate change.
And a story that ultimately poses a question central to addressing the climate crisis. What will it take to actually, successfully, implement the renewable energy projects needed to transition away from fossil fuels? All right. So the podcast, which I'm calling Floating an Idea, the Sweetwater Solar Saga, will be coming out soon. But I just want to take a second to thank everyone who has supported and helped me throughout this process, my family, my friends, everyone who I interviewed, and Karen for introducing me to this story. Thank you. Any questions?
That was a really good talk, Grace. My question is, so there was a few people kind of, maybe you were suggesting this as well, that kind of they don't want to do this solar project because maybe there's an even better project out there, but do you think people kind of just, that's maybe of a white lie, and in the sense that when the new project does come, are they kind of just going to repeat the same cycle, or do you think people are actually really looking for alternative solutions here?
That's a great question and kind of exactly the sort of thing that I wanted to explore. And one of the things that I do go into in the podcast a little bit more is how it's important for governments and developers to actually work with communities to understand what sort of projects they would be supportive of and help them sort of be more involved in that process, and that through doing that, you can actually get them on board and pursue those projects. Yeah.
You had mentioned how many people had valid concerns as it pertains to the risk associated with it on the water and how it might leach and contaminate it.
Yeah.
Did you offer any studies or conversations surrounding the integrity of the proposed?
Yeah, so that is also another thing that the podcast gets into. But I talked to one researcher at Indiana University who's currently doing a study on whether or not floating solar panels leach chemicals. So he is working with several other researchers, but they just got started. So we're going to have to wait on the results for that one. But yeah, it is something that has been studied some and is being studied more.
Nice. Thank you.
Thank you.